period. So the next thing I want to go over now is a generalized discussion of the role of women in this period. And then the final thing I want to do is very briefly touch on a few of the significant women in this period and their relationship to the kind of questions that we're covering in class. Okay, first question, what characterizes the monarchic period? In fact, before we talk about women in the monarchic period, I just want to talk a little bit about the period itself. What characterizes the monarchic period? Let me just run through this rather briefly. One, an attempt with greater and lesser degrees of success to centralize Israelite society, mostly around the institution of the monarchy. Two, we see during this period a unique relationship between Yahweh and the royal family, particularly the descendants of David. There's a promise made by David's prophet Nathan that there will never lack a descendant of David on the throne in Jerusalem, ever. An unqualified promise. So there's a very unique relationship between David's family and Yahweh. Three, there's a strong priesthood and religious hierarchy that develops, although not as strong as in the next period following the Israelite monarchy. And finally, increasing divisions between the rich and the poor. Okay, now how about the role of women? I broke this up into two general sections. The first having to do with women in their roles in the Israelite narratives regarding the kings and the monarchy, and the second section, images of women used in Israelite poetry written during this time, particularly the writing of the prophets. First, what I call the role of princesses, queens, and queen mothers. And there is an important distinction between queens and queen mothers. A queen is married to the king. A queen mother is the mother to a king, which usually means that the previous king, her husband, has died. And queen mothers within ancient Near Eastern societies held certain unique places. So these are the figures with which we're primarily concerned. And notice they're all members of royalty. The primary concern of the writings during the period of the monarchy is our concerns with royalty, the royal family, and the people that surround the royal family. There are exceptions to that, as we'll see, but for the most part. So we got princesses, queens, and queen mothers. How do they function within the narrative? Well, as you might imagine, the same expectations about women that we've seen previously do continue during this period. That is, women are ultimately understood in terms of their roles as mothers, as producers of children. And more particularly, the concern here is mothers produce heirs, those who will inherit the power and the property from the previous generation. And since we're talking about royalty here, we are especially interested in heirs because, in fact, the heirs become the next set of royalty, the next king, the next queens. So this becomes, as with women in every other period that we've studied, a key role that the women plays, perhaps the most important role as they understood it, as the producers of the next king, the producers of the next heir. Once again, because these are royalty, we see another role that begins to emerge, and that's the role of the former of alliances. I could say pawns in military alliances. And it works like this. One king wants to make an alliance with another king. Now, signatures didn't mean as much, and there was an element of hostage-taking in this, and there was also an element of two powerful men joining their families. But one king would give his daughter in marriage either to the other king, the one he's making the treaty with, or to that king's son. So, for instance, when the king of Tyre in Phoenicia wanted to make an alliance with King Omri of Israel, the northern kingdom, what he does is he sends his daughter Jezebel to marry King Omri's son Ahab, and so there's an alliance formed. Now this works, as I said, in two ways. First of all, we have a hostage. If the king whose daughter is now living in the royal household of his rival wants to make any trouble, well then, for instance, King Omri could just throw Jezebel in prison or even have her executed. So it's a hostage. But more frequently, what these intermarriages represented were either a less powerful king using this as a stepping stone to gain proximity to greater power, or a genuine desire to join the two families. So whereas they were representing two separate sets of interests, now through this marriage, the issue of this relationship will now be a grandson of both kings. So it joins them in family. But in any case, what we have here are women used as pawns, as bargaining chips in various kinds of international diplomacy. But it does not end there, because there are two rather powerful aspects of women that are introduced in a new way during this period. And they are, first of all, women who represent or embody, we'll say, forces of political power. Women in these positions, in many cases, did not have any structural power, that is, power that was built into their office as queen or queen mother, but through informal ways, through force of their personality, they could begin to exert influence on the king, or in some cases, as we shall see, completely dominate and control the king, and in some cases rule the nation without a king. So we have women here as foci of political power, carrying political power not so much by virtue of their relationship to a man, but rather having the political power themselves. Now, as you'd imagine, as you have experience from our previous class here, what we're going to see is enormous hostility on the part of the Israelite writers against women who assert this kind of power. Which brings me to the final consideration here, and this is one we get bare hints of in many places, not nearly enough information for my taste, but we could begin to use our imagination to fill in the gaps, because we have women as leaders of religious movements. Now, once again, the biblical writers are enormously hostile to the notion of these women and their religious ideas. So, for instance, Jezebel, the woman I mentioned earlier, the Phoenician Tyrian queen, becomes queen in Israel, the northern kingdom, and with the death of her husband Ahab becomes queen mother, and she consciously tries to transform the religion of Israel into a carbon copy of the religion that she herself believes, the religion that she brings with her from her homeland in Phoenicia. So we see some hints here, and we'll see that also in comments of the prophets of women leading in worship of various divine figures, such as the Queen of Heaven. We'll be talking about her in the subsequent, the last class of the semester. So we see women leading in these, so much so that at a period at the very end of the Israelite monarchy, actually after it, a few years after it, where the people are saying that the reason that they were destroyed by the Babylonians is because they stopped worshiping the Queen of Heaven. And they insist to Jeremiah, the prophet of Yahweh, that from now on they are going to listen to their wives and worship the Queen of Heaven, and they weren't going to listen to Jeremiah. So these two instances of strength and independent autonomous power on the part of the women is greeted with enormous hostility in the stories that we're going to read. So I suggest here, assuming you're reading this before you read the primary text, that you're seeing this before you read the primary text, I suggest that you try to counter-read some of these passages. And you ask yourself, whose interests are served by portraying these women so negatively? And whose interests might be represented by these women if they were painted more positively? So just be thinking about that as you read these passages.